I think what's really hard in those moments is that you feel this kind of sense of shame. And so why we talk about it, why we're open about it, I think both of us, and why you sort of wanted to do this podcast, is to make people realize there's nothing shameful about these sort of moments in your career.
It happens to everyone. Everyone has bumps along the way. There's a sense that somehow it's on you, that it's personal, and it's not. I think normalizing that is just something we need to do because it reminds us all that we're not alone. Today on The Messy Parts, we're trying something really different. Many of you have said you get bits and pieces of my story, but you don't have the whole thing. And there's a lot of messy parts to my story. So we decided to listen. And we invited my sister, Susie Banikarim. She's 7 years younger than me, an award-winning journalist, Peabodys, Emmys, Neiman's, to come on and flip the script. So today, we're going to have Susie interviewing me about the many messy parts. And let me just say, she wanted me to cry, but she didn't succeed. So get ready.
How does it feel to be on the other side?
A little frightening, vulnerable.
Yeah. Are you worried I'm going to Barbara Walters you? I'm going to make you cry?
I don't cry.
Sometimes.
Rarely.
Rarely. I'm the crier between the two of us.
So, no, I'm not afraid.
Okay, well, I'll try not to cry. So let's start at the beginning. Obviously, you and I were very much shaped by the fact that we were born in Iran and we went through the Iranian Revolution. That happened when I was 3, but you were 10. So it was in many ways more memorable for you. It shaped you more. What do you think it sort of did to you to have to go through something so traumatic so early?
Well, for me, it didn't feel traumatic when I was going through it. Honestly, as a kid, I found it exhilarating, which is just kind of an interesting thing to think about because I didn't process the fear. Now, when I think back of, when people with armed guns broke into the house, I have to imagine that our parents, our grandmother, who was a very small lady, had to have been scared. But as a kid, it just was like an adrenaline rush. And interestingly, as you know, I went to an American school in Iran. And my teacher had instituted a current events morning session. And I was the kid who always came in with an article. I was so interested in what was happening and wanted to talk about it. And I remember her saying to Mom, our mother, that she thought I'd be a journalist. And my mom said that was a fate worse than death because, as you know, all the journalists were being killed at the time.
Awkward.
It was awkward, but also kind of interesting. And I think there was sort of no room to process things in that way in our family. So it was kind of like, shove the emotion someplace else and just figure out how to keep moving.
Right. So you make it through the revolution, but I guess, and you find that sort of exhilarating, but then you do end up in Paris, right? Our parents first went to Paris and then eventually we would end up in the US. It still had to be somewhat traumatizing to suddenly be pulled out of your life, right? Even at 3, I kind of remember being very disoriented by that. Did you not find those sort of like moves and the resetting disorienting?
I must have, but
Yeah.
I think that I was pretty disconnected from my feelings. That was a weird gift and a curse in some ways, because I think it has two sides to it. They say your memories are held in your muscles. I think my muscles have a lot of memories waiting to come out. But I didn't really process it that way. Of course, I remember showing up at, in Lafayette for junior high, being dressed like a French schoolgirl when everybody else was wearing Izods and Calvin Klein jeans and feeling very much an outsider. I was definitely a nerdy kid. I got bumped up from 7th grade to 8th grade. So there was all these moments where I didn't feel like I belonged, but I didn't process it kind of in that way. I just sort of put my head down and tried to figure out the puzzle, right? How do I fit in? How do I join bowling, even though I was a terrible bowler and had never bowled before?
I didn't know you were on the bowling team.
I joined everything in junior high.
That
Softball,
I did know, but I didn't know bowling.
There wasn't a thing I didn't join. It's true.
You grew up in California, right? You mentioned Lafayette. That's the small town where we ended up in California. And you spend most of your formative years there after the revolution. And, I think for both of us, there's this second loss that's extremely formative. Much later on, our dad dies in a very sudden windsurfing accident, if people who are listening can believe it. At that point, you're in college, you're at Barnard in New York. How does that sort of shape you?
I would say that for me, that was the third thing, because before the Iranian Revolution, we had an uncle who you didn't really know.
Right.
And he died when I was in second grade in a car accident. And he was my favorite uncle in that he was the one who would buy me flowers that were called Maryam's. And I was very close to him. And he died. I was at grandma's and I heard the news first. And then mom came over. This was before a cell phone. So, she came to the house and I just blurted out that he was dead. And I remember her just like sitting down, and it was a very traumatic event. Now I think back and I wonder, how did our grandmother just continue on at the loss of a child like that? So I would say dad was the third one. So it just feels like there was a lot of bumps along the way. I was very much a daddy's girl, as you know.
Yes.
And when dad passed away suddenly, he had actually gone back to Iran the year before, right? So we had grown up in California. I come to Barnard and they moved to London, and dad says he's going to go back to Iran, and he knew he was blacklisted. So most people would think that would be traumatic. He came to see me. He said he was leaving. If something happened to him, I was in charge. I mean, it was a lot to put on somebody who was like 17. He goes back to Iran. His passport's confiscated. He stays there for a year. He gets smuggled out through the border because he couldn't get out. So he comes out and we meet him in Switzerland, in Geneva, to give him his green card so that he can come back to the States and I could go back to college. And he said, you know what, I'm not going to see you again for a couple of months because you're going to go back to college. Let's just take a couple of days between us as a family and go on vacation. And as you described, we stop in Interlaken. I go into town with mom to buy a bathing suit, and we come back and he's drowned. So highly sudden. But in that moment, mom did the thing that she started doing really from when her brother died, which was completely fall apart.
Right.
And I have this vivid memory of being at this quaint hotel at the lake. You're totally not processing anything.
I think I went to sleep right away.
You went to sleep right away. She's freaking out, yelling, right? And it was incomprehensible. And they gave her some Valium and then a bill for the Valium,
They
as
wanted
one
us
does.
out of there. They were like, we do not want a grieving family on the grounds.
And, I had to drive the car. I was like, I had to get us to Geneva. Then I had to get us from Geneva back. I mean, somebody had to be like the functioning one. That wasn't going to be mom in that moment. And you were too young. So I think, like anything, it wasn't really processed. I remember coming back to Barnard, and dad had come to visit. He was definitely like a larger than life character. And people were like, how's your dad? And I was like, he drowned. And somebody pulled me aside and said, you really can't say it like that. And I was like, well, what's the right way to say it? They were like, you can say he passed away. And so then the next person shows up and they say, how's your dad? I said, well, he passed away. And they said, well, what happened? And I say, he drowned. And they're like, is he okay? I was like, okay, I'm never going to get this. I'm never going to get this.
No, once you drown, you're not okay. Yeah. It's over.
So I think I didn't even process it then, right? So we went back, you went back to California, and a couple weeks later, I came home for what was his funeral, and I still hadn't cried. But I remember walking into our family friend Saurabh's house, and they had these blown up pictures of him.
Oh my God. I remember those pictures. They were like poster size.
They were like poster size. And I remember walking in with all these people, and I really didn't want to feel my emotions. And I walked in and I was so traumatized by walking in that I went right into the bathroom and just like took a moment and asked to go home.
I think the shock of it partially was that once we got to Switzerland, right? We knew he was escaping through the border. We were waiting for that to happen. We got the news that he'd actually gotten out safely, and we got to Switzerland. We thought it was like we could breathe a sigh of relief. And then to suddenly have this thing happen out of the blue was just really, I don't think there's another word for it, but traumatic, right? Like I remember that as an extremely traumatic thing. I was waiting at the shore for him to come get me. He was supposed to give me a windsurfing lesson that day. So when you think back on that, I think we all kind of went numb initially, right? And then we had the two funerals, like one in San Francisco, one in LA. It was just a process. But then at what point did you realize, okay, this is, really happening, and I need to like figure out a way to pick myself up and keep going? Or did you just automatically?
I don't know that I've still processed that. To be honest, I don't know. Natasha, my daughter, often says, you don't feel things, Mom. And I think there was no room to process that. What I remember is Mom not just crying, wailing the entire drive to Geneva. Right. And then we had to sleep in the airport because there were no flights.
I remember that.
And I remember she just wouldn't stop crying. I have this vivid memory. For some reason, we had like a souvenir spoon, and I remember picking up the souvenir spoon, and I started talking to the souvenir spoon like as if it was my dad. Yes. And I think that jarred her out of just not stopping.
You were telling jokes. I remember you had the spoon and you were like telling jokes and
I don't know where I developed those coping mechanisms. Do you know what I mean? I don't know.
well, I mean, I think they're coping mechanisms, but they're also somewhat maladaptive, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's true that you don't feel things. I know Natasha makes that joke, but I mean, I know better than anyone that you feel things very deeply, but you do tend to try and move through you're sort of trying to dance around the feeling as much as possible.
I just have a way to push it aside. I don't know. Sometimes I think that's not the healthiest thing, but it definitely, Nikki says it's a very good coping mechanism.
Right.
Which, I don't think that's actually true.
Well, it's a lucky one, I guess. Like it has its benefits, where some coping mechanisms are all bad. Yours has some
benefits.
pros and some cons, but it does catch up with you, right?
It's like being a comedian, right? Like they make jokes about things that are actually based on very painful things. Even to this day, I can just say, oh, what's one of your messy part? Oh, when my dad drowned, like as if I'm doing a comedy bit.
Right.
But the truth is, that was a very life-altering moment for us because really we lost both parents in that moment.
Yes. So I think that is something that took me many years of therapy to understand, that it was like, the sort of thing that I thought was the most traumatic thing in my life, which was losing my father, was only partially the most traumatic thing because it was also many years before mom was really functioning again. And so there was this incredible period of time where you were in college but coming home pretty regularly, and I was 11 when he passed, so I was still at home, and it was a rough time. So you go back to college and you're young, right? You had gone to college a year younger than most people. You've gone through this kind of terrible thing, but in many ways you talk about Barnard as having saved you. So what is it about Barnard that is so meaningful for you? Why does that become such a safe space for you?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that, the move from Paris to Lafayette, we went to a very waspy suburb of California's where everybody was very homogeneous. I was very much focused on fitting in. I think by the time I came to New York, and it was a gift ending up in New York City and at Barnard, and I got into Barnard off the wait list. It was like sort of a last minute thing.
I forgot about that.
In New York, there's 6 or 8 of every single person, so there is no homogeneity. So you had the opportunity to be who you are. And so I think for me, slowly that began to happen, right? And so sort of in a similar way that I sort of moved through things, my freshman year, somebody said in the hallway, you should run for class president. And I did, and I won, right? Like all these things began to happen. And I began to sort of feel the weight of possibility. And I had an internship every semester, from Style with Elsa Clench to working for a photography agent in the East Village to the Brooklyn Academy of Music, right? It was like being a kid in a candy shop. And there was something about New York that just fit. And the possibilities in New York were endless. And I think the moment Dad died, the thing that I really appreciate, and I think my connection to Barnard deepened, is at that moment, we entered financial insecurity. And I came back and the school called and they said, we're here for you. And they really were. And I think
really
that
lovely.
we remember people who are there for us, not in the good times, but in the bad times, because that's rare. So I think my connection to Barnard is really like cemented by that experience. Not just all the great memories I have, but at the moment of need where they just told me that they were there for me.
You're on the board now,
I am.
and your daughter went there. I went there.
And our cousin.
Our cousin Nisha. So you're
We go
very much a
deep.
Barnard girl.
They call it a Barnard woman.
A Barnard
that was one of
woman.
the first
That's
things you
right.
learn.
That's
Not
right.
girl, woman.
Okay, so your last semester, though, you end up going abroad. I mean, for all that you love Barnard, you sort of have this desire to strike out on your own. And we were kind of a traveling family. Like, we were always traveling, which I think has made me slightly less obsessed with traveling, but I think made you much more interested. Because I think I found it disorienting. Like,
Well,
I felt like we were always moving.
It was disorienting. Even in Lafayette, we kept moving homes. It was like they had ants in their pants. And I joke that, when they stopped, I couldn't stop all of a sudden, right? Like I definitely wanted the safety and security, but on the flip side, I just become accustomed to motion. I now look back and I think, what was I thinking that I decided to do my second semester senior year abroad?
Right, because your last semester of college is supposed to be just like chill.
And that's when you're supposed to be looking for a job.
Right.
And I think for me, there was sort of a sense that if I went abroad, I wouldn't be on campus and tempted by the jobs that came recruiting. And so then I would go pursue my passion. I really bought into that, like pursue your passion thing. I came back from Paris, which is where I was abroad, in August. I applied to graduate school because I had won a Truman Scholarship, which I was surprised by myself. And I thought I had to use it in a certain amount of time, which turns out not to have been true. I decided I would go to international affairs school because I thought that I could then be a foreign correspondent and write about what I was studying.
Right.
Somebody said, you don't make any money in international affairs school, tack on a business degree. So I listened. It's so amazing that I just listened to people. And while I was waiting to see if I got in, I picked up and moved to Argentina where I knew no one. And I think, again, I'd taken this class at Barnard called Personality and Politics. And what I had discovered is that sometimes the environment shapes you. So Nelson Mandela gets jailed and he becomes a leader he is. And I thought, I was going to manufacture that for myself. Argentina was having political turmoil. And I thought, I thought I'd be a journalist. I was like, if I go put myself in that pathway, I thought I was going to go down there and write for the Buenos Aires Herald. And I get there and I sneak my way onto a movie set because I thought if I then got a story, then the Buenos Aires Herald would hire me. They were shooting Highlander 2 with Sean Connery and Christopher Lambert. I sneak on the set, trying to get a story. I said, I heard you were hiring people. And they said, sit here. And I brought a woman with me who I'd just met, who was nervous, but I was like, don't worry, I'll do the talking. And as I'm writing down people's phone numbers, because in those old days, they put them on the production wall, they said, come with us. They had just happened to fire the entire production team, which almost never happens on a movie. Not only did I get hired on the film, so did the woman who came with me. So all of a sudden, I went from trying to have this revolutionary experience to having a job on an American film, getting paid in dollars, and having a driver that would take me from my little apart hotel to the studios in Biras. It was crazy.
Why business school then?
I didn't want to go to business school. I really tried hard to avoid business, right? I added the business degree because somebody said if I added one more year, I would be able to pay for myself. So I think part of the reason I didn't end up becoming a journalist was I was the eldest and I got anxiety from having debt. So I made the choice to go into basically the lowest paying job coming out of business school, which was advertising. It was a creative side of business. I did a summer in investment banking and I definitely needed the money and I got paid a lot of money that summer, but I was like, I just couldn't do it.
Miserable. I remember you being miserable.
It was just not for me. So I just made a choice to go into a different side of the business world. And I worked in media, which was close, right? I got close, but I didn't feel like I had financial freedom to go do that, which, years later, I come around full circle. Yeah. Mom used to say, it's never too late to be Oprah. And I used to roll my eyes and cringe. And I'm like, maybe she's right.
It's okay. So now you do have these 2 degrees. You have these 2 graduate degrees. You start out in advertising and, you're still kind of deciding what to do with your life. You don't stay in advertising very long. What's the kind of path? Not, we don't have to go into every detail.
Yeah. Because I've had 800 jobs.
Yes.
I started in advertising. It was in the early days of the internet and I had boundless energies, kind of like our grandmother. And so I would go to every session I could in the evenings or lectures that were happening at Y&R. And I tried to convince Y&R that they needed to get ready for the future with the internet. And this was in the early days, like CD-ROMs, Prodigy, CompuServe. I offered to organize an agency-wide conference, which is crazy. They'd never had an agency-wide conference. And in doing that event, which was really to talk about whether, in fact, advertising was dead, I learned something about Y&R, which is that they weren't ready to actually progress. They had mentors for us there.
Yeah.
And my mentor pulled me aside and said, organizing this conference is very political. You should just stop doing it. There's other people who want to be in charge. And I was so thrown by that. I thought, well, if this company doesn't respond to my just doing something that I'm interested in that just benefits everyone, why would I stay here? Long story short, I ended up going to work at Turner Broadcasting for a guy named Steve Heyer, who was a very smart, strategic thinker. I thought I would be a documentary filmmaker, a journalist of some kind. This was my closest next move, was working in this first ever integrated sales marketing group at Turner. I go there, but the pathway to more creative jobs wasn't in New York, which is where sales was. And I get recruited to go work at City Search in the very early days of the internet.
You have to explain what City Search is.
So City Search is like Time Out, basically online. It was like a searchable engine.
It was like a very early website when there were not a lot of websites.
It was part of IndieNet, which were the first 7 internet companies in New York. Right. And I go work at City Search. And it was amazing. It was really like the Wild West. But they had done San Francisco, then they'd done Charlotte, and they were very wary of New York. And so they decided to put the New York market on hold. And I was like, whoa, I can't just put my career on hold. They said, well, you can join Rollout, where you every 3 months go to open up another market. And I was just getting married. And I was like, oh, that's not going to work for me. When I'd been offered that job, I'd also been offered a job at Macmillan and they kept calling. And so I was like, I'm going to go take this other job because I can't be on pause. And so I ended up going to be a book publisher, and I was like a youngest book publisher by like 40 years. I tried a lot of different things.
Right.
I was willing to move when most people were not. Sometimes the moves worked, and sometimes like I take a job at Ammirati because they were paying me when Macmillan wasn't willing to pay. And I get there and he was totally nuts. And so they offered me a package and I left, and they shut down that department. But all of a sudden now I've had like 20 jobs when most people had one job.
Right.
And I was now pregnant. So I was like, oh my God, now what's going to happen to me? So it was kind of a terrifying moment of like, what the heck? But I had always wanted to have a bag business. So I met a woman, I started a bag business. There's a lot of these stories in my background, but end up starting to do consulting. And 5 years of that, I ended up going back into corporate America at Univision, where it was the first place I became CMO.
Right. So you've kind of made your way up the corporate ladder, but this is like sort of a very uncertain time, right? I mean, I remember there were lots of sort of moments of doubt, and it was difficult. And I think for a lot of people, those 20s and early 30s are a very uncertain time. What made it possible for you to keep making these changes? I think most people are much more risk averse than you and I are, right? So what is it you think that makes it possible for you to take these kind of big swings?
Well, I mean, I clearly have the ability to push past fear and put it in a little box on the side, because it was terrifying. I mean, being pregnant without a job when people wanted you to have worked at one job, not 20 jobs, made you a little bit unhireable, right? At the beginning, I was eminently hireable in the world of advertising because I'd gotten to Mickey Drexler and he'd, return my phone call. So that story just would make people offer you a job. But by the time,
tell the story if you're going to mention it.
Well, I mean, when I was in college, I had this travel column. There was an advertising campaign called Individuals of Styles. I sort of mocked it up. Why I thought to mock it up, I don't know. I sent it to somebody at the Gap. Nothing happened. But then in business school, somebody had heard Mickey Drexler speak. He convinces me to send it to Mickey Drexler pre-internet. And I do, and he calls me. And he's like, do you want a job at the Gap? I'm like, no, I just want to make the book. Because again, I wasn't focused on the job thing. And they say to me, this is really a marketing idea. You should go into marketing, right? So that made me, like, if I told that story, and I give people that advice, which is like, look for your Mickey Drexler story, because that story said she has ideas, she can make things happen. It made you eminently hireable, and it made you come off the page, right? But once you've done 8 jobs, when most people stay at one job, they're like, oh, you're a career switcher, right? You get labeled. So I was worried. I would say I was fortunate that I prioritized relationships. So the first consulting job I got was from somebody that I'd worked with early on. If somebody asked me to do something, I never dropped the ball. That was like one of my things. I remember I had a boss who once said to me, why are you working late? I said, I was doing a project for somebody. And she said, oh, he's unimportant. And she flicked and said, don't bother. And I just thought, like, that was the craziest thing. If I'd given somebody my word that I was going to do a project,
right,
I wasn't going to be like, you're not politically important. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do it.
Right.
Those relationships then came to bear. So people would call me for projects, for work. And I think that also helped, because a lot of my moves came from relationships.
Right. So you've kind of gone through this period of uncertainty. You end up at Univision. You've had a kid at this point. You've had Natasha at this point.
I think by the time I went to Univision, I had 2 kids.
You had both,
Yeah.
Natasha and Nikki. What was that like? What was introducing motherhood into the mix like?
Well, it's funny. I remember we had a friend who was a Magnum photographer, and he came to stay with us when I just had Natasha, and he started taking pictures of me pushing Natasha with the stroller. And Andy, my husband, said, why is he taking pictures? And he said, I never thought I would see the day where Maryam would be a mother. I just wasn't focused on that. And so I just barreled through. I mean, I was pregnant, and I was doing consulting and the bags. So 3 days a week, I would fly around doing this consulting project because it was paying me cash. And then 2 days a week, I was shipping bags from the house. And I literally was running through the streets of New York with like skins of leather on my back, because that's when the garment district still actually was in the garment district. So I was busy, and my drug is busy. So I wasn't really processing it. I think like I finally said to them, I'm too big to come in. They said, we'll send a car. So literally my last day of working on the consulting project was the day I gave birth.
Okay.
So,
Crazy.
it's the truth. It's the truth. I mean, not things you recommend now to people.
Well, also you did, in fairness, you had an emergency delivery.
But I was a week away.
Right, you were a week away.
And the second child, same thing. I literally had an emergency C-section, and I had committed to a project at Time Warner. And a week after having an emergency C-section, I was hobbling through, I don't recommend this to people. I'm just saying, I was hobbling through the halls of Time Warner because I had committed to being in a meeting because don't drop a deadline.
It's so crazy. I mean, remember, it was hard to like keep you still. Like I remember after the first one, after Natasha, you'd had the C-section also, and it was impossible to keep you from like trying to do things, like lift things even. Like you were
To this day, they're
Yeah.
like the family jokes. Why can't mom sit still? So Natasha was a week early. And, so I go in, you get an epidural, and for those who don't know, my husband's in the room and I'm giving birth. They bring the baby out of my cut up stomach. And at that point, I try to sit up because with an epidural, you're conscious. You're not totally out, right? And I try to sit up. Everybody freaks out and they give me a shot so that I pass out. Because even in that situation, I was like, oh, the baby's out. I'm good. Let's go.
Right. Well, this sort of gets back to this idea that you're always bobbing and weaving. You're always trying to like not sit still because in the stillness, you have to really process everything that you're sort of going through.
I think there's an adage, like nothing sticks to rolling stone or something like that, right? I became addicted to motion because motion is actually the only constant. And stillness terrified me. I mean, when Dad died, Barnard sent me to therapy. And I went to therapy and I couldn't even understand what was happening. Therapy wasn't a thing when we grew up. And I remember she said to me, why don't you come back when you're actually ready to talk about it? Which, was actually probably terrible advice.
Yeah, you're like, never. I will never be ready.
I was like, oh, okay. Well, I never went back. I didn't go back to therapy for years.
Right.
So sitting still and processing, that wasn't a thing.
Do you think you're still like that?
Yes.
And you've been to therapy now. Do you think you've slowed down in any ways?
When I go to therapy, I'm always like, okay, what's the solution? And I think he's like, no, that's not really what that's about.
Right. That's not how it works.
But I'm looking to, I'm like, I need to get to the goal. I mean, I think I've mellowed some. I think when you're in these high powered jobs, you can barely breathe at the job, much less juggling your personal life, your kids. I joke with women who have had those kinds of jobs. Like all of a sudden you're like, I used to be an interesting person. What happened to my friends? I had no friends. You didn't have time.
Right.
I was like, there's not so much room. And by the way, it's not like it's always hunky-dory on the home front. There's things that happen with your children, with your parents, with your spouse. Like it's a lot. But I think I was determined to push through.
Did you have mom guilt? Like, did you struggle with sort of not being able to be there as much as you wanted to be?
I mean, a little, but I just knew I was never that person. And when I was around and present, I made everybody crazy. So, I remember being like, the swing was my worst nightmare, like repetitive, continuous motion. I was like, I will take you to any event. Let's go conquer the world. But like repeating something just was never who I was going to be. There were times, there was definitely in middle school when Natasha struggled, there was a moment I thought like, should I stop? But I was very fortunate. I was fortunate in that I worked with people over and over again, even though I switched jobs, we moved jobs together. And so I had a support system at work where I knew I could count on them. People say you have to have boundaries and, don't give the job what it won't give you back. And those are all true things because you will get, pushed out when it's convenient. That is definitely a thing in the world. But on the flip side, you don't get to the C-suite, particularly as a woman and an immigrant woman or whatever, if you don't have that kind of hustle. There's not a person who doesn't come on this podcast where I think to myself, wow, they did not have incredible drive and they did not work incredibly hard. And those are choices, you know what I mean?
Yes.
And I look at the younger generation and the ones who are content creators, they work 24/7. It's not like they have no drive.
Right.
If you want to accomplish that, whatever it is, being a writer, being an actor, whatever, you got to have hustle.
There were times I think, especially, with the kids where they asked you to slow down or be more present or get off your phone.
Oh, a lot of get off your phone.
A lot of get off your phone. How did you handle that?
Well, I mean, sometimes I would get mad or I was defensive for sure. I mean, when I paused between Hyatt and Nextdoor, it was because, I was always moving, right? When some job's not working out. I was always a plan A, plan B, plan C person. So I was going to get another job. And I was about to take another job. And I remember Nikki, who was, I say, not my most verbal child at the time. He's verbal now. He said to me, Mom, I understand if you take this job and reverse commute to New York for my last year of high school. I just want you to know I would miss you. Right. And honestly, Nikki wasn't the one to say that. And it really made me pause. And I, addicted to motion, was like already on to the next thing, but I paused. And that was a hard time.
So let's get there. So you end up at Univision. You're the youngest or first CMO?
First CMO.
First CMO ever, youngest by by default. And you end up doing a few other jobs in between, NBC, Gannett, et cetera. You end up at Hyatt. You move to Chicago. It's the only time you've not lived in New York for this job at Hyatt. And after the Hyatt job, you did take this break that you just described. But I think that period was also difficult because you didn't feel like you got to leave Hyatt in the way that you wanted, right? Like having achieved all the things that you wanted. What was that like?
It was difficult. That job was great until it wasn't, which is often the case. Now, I had never moved for a job before, and I remember being anxious about the idea of moving for a job. And I moved a 9th grader and an 11th grader, and that was a thing. I felt an incredible sense of responsibility for having moved them across, the country to Chicago, and my husband, right, who, had sort of a whole life here. And I take this job, and it's a global job, and I'm never home. So it was hard on Andy, and it wasn't smooth sailing with the kids in high school. Right. And I was always on a plane. It was like, I need you in Tokyo for 48 hours. And like I said, I'm not the person who lets you down. So I was everywhere and nowhere. The job was great until we didn't get the Starwood deal. And then all of a sudden the job wasn't so great. And I knew that. And I definitely was your girl Friday. Like, I was not just the CMO, I also did the strategy work with the CEO and all those things. And at the time, I remember we moved offices and I sat with the team, and I remember being like, this is going to be a decision. Like, I can keep going at this pace and not really be present, and it can have implications for my family. Or I can just say, like, I'm just not going to be available in the same way, and there may be a cost to that. Also, we were moving mountains at a pace that was really unprecedented. I mean, honestly, we redid the loyalty program in a year. I didn't realize that redoing an entire loyalty program in a year was unprecedented. And, people say, fail, but it's okay, but they don't really mean it. And so when things went wrong, you just knew. You knew that there was going to be a consequence. And so you make the best decisions you can, but it's like you can see the train coming. It was amazing, and then it wasn't. And so I knew that before they knew that. I mean, frankly, many people on the executives team started exiting. And I remember one of them left and said, when are you coming? And I was like, oh my God, what is happening? What is happening to me? By the way, I've now moved people. Like, there's no other job I'm going to get in Chicago. I was not planning on staying in Chicago. So I was close on another job. But Nikki really made me stop. And it was difficult. It was, all these jobs are difficult. I mean, there were so many moments in every single job that was difficult. But
the quiet was also difficult.
But the quiet was difficult. I remember taking a lot of walks with the dog around the lake. I was moving, physically moving. I got to see what Chicago was like. I couldn't even tell you where anything was because I was never home. So it was really a gift to reconnect with myself, with my husband, with my children. I mean, one day Nikki said to me, Mom, you're the busiest unemployed person I know, because
that's true.
I was an executive in residence. I wrote an article for the New York Times. I got asked to be on podcasts. So you're not good at slowing down. I think advice
you're not good at slowing down.
I'm not good.
I'm great at slowing down.
I know everybody in the family makes fun of me. But somebody gave me advice early on, which I give to anyone who's going through sort of this like interval pause moment, which is, he said, you're type A. You should treat your time off as a gap year. Make a list of 3 things you're going to accomplish because the time will go by. And it was really a great piece of advice. So I was like, okay, I'd like to spend time by the water where my grandmother is so I can get to know her. I'm going to go back to writing. So I started doing what all type A people do, is I looked for the perfect writing class, like as if that existed. Finally, I was like, what am I doing? And I just signed up for a memoir writing class at Second City. It was me and 8 strangers. And the first day she gave us an assignment, I came in and I'd written 60 pages. And my husband said to me, oh, this woman doesn't know what's coming her way. She looked at the 60 pages and she said, let's chunk it out. You don't need to write anymore. We'll just break this out for the next 6 weeks.
That's hilarious.
But it got me to writing. And then when people started calling me and saying things like, are you sure you're not going to take another job? It's so brave. You're not going to get back in. I ended up finding myself writing a story that then led to the piece that the New York Times published that was about what are you if not employed? Because you would go to parties and the thing that happens to all of us is like, it's not that the phone totally stopped ringing, but you would go to a party and they'd be like, well, she was the former global CMO at Hyatt Hotels. Like as if your identity doesn't exist without that. And all of a sudden you were the former. And people didn't know how to introduce you at a party.
Yeah. Well, you and I talk about this a lot, right? Because we've both taken all these pauses, and the advice I give anyone who's taking a pause is to sort of figure out what that story is, how they answer questions like that. Because I think once you have that narrative, you don't owe anyone the truth, right? You don't owe anyone exactly what you're doing or why, but you do need an answer for those moments. And the longer you wait to figure out what the answer is, the more difficult it feels when you're in those moments. You feel sort of like very put on the spot. So I kind of feel like that's one of the most important pieces. But, you know, I think there are these moments, right? So you end up writing this article for the New York Times that sort of explores this idea of how do I define myself, if not through my career. And this is something you talk about a lot on the podcast, right? It's very shiny from the outside. From the outside, it seems like you've just had this amazing career and everything kind of just went your way. And, you know, your adaptive behavior is doing more things, like how lucky for you. But you do have dark moments, you know, and I think you and I both have those. And there's many times where I think I call you or you call me and say, like, am I a loser? Like, am I a loser now? And I want you to sort of talk about that, like what those moments feel like and how you figure out a way to get through those.
I don't know. I have them every day. It's not like it's a once in an occasion kind of a moment. I just have the ability to just then put one foot in front of the other, which I think is a coping mechanism, but I think it's a good one because when it becomes insurmountable, then you freeze. That period was hard. It seems shiny because, you know, I wrote the New York Times article and it like opened up all kinds of pathways, but it was incredibly, incredibly difficult. I'm a marketer and I'm less afraid of, I guess, putting myself out there. So, you know, I think I quickly was like, I'm living a portfolio life. I had a name for it and, you know.
You branded it.
I branded it. And again, I mean, relationships saved me, right? People called me and asked me to be an executive in residence at Columbia or, you know, to work on a consulting project. So things come your way if you build relationships along the way. It's not like overnight you have no skills. But I think that there were definitely low points. I got busy pretty quickly. I'm good at keeping myself busy, but there were definitely days where you were like, is it over? Am I not going to find another job? Because I wasn't thinking I was done. It really matters to not recede. It's so hard for people. It was hard for me, but you have to push yourself to still go to things when you're invited. And in one of those evenings where I was invited to a Fast Company event, I sat next to Jana Rich, who at the time was a headhunter, and she's the one who said, would you consider the next door job, which is what led me to the next job. Yeah, sometimes you go to that cocktail party and they say former or whatever, or they don't engage with you and you feel bad, but you have to push yourself to keep going. And I think that's just like anything. It's like you got to get back on the bike, right? I think people's instinct is to over-explain or to disappear. And I say that's exactly the wrong thing. Now, yes, there are days where you don't feel good and yeah, you should take a minute, but hiding is not the answer, right? And I think also it's a gift to pause. I mean, I just want to be clear. As a kid who had student loans, I would not have been able to do that.
It's a privilege.
It was a total privilege. You know, I got to spend time with my grandmother that I would never get back. It allowed me to be introspective and think about things a little bit more than I had before.
Well, and I think part of the podcast, right, part of talking about this stuff is to remove some of the shame, right? I think what's really hard in those moments is that you feel this kind of sense of shame. And so why we talk about it, why we're open about it, I think both of us, and why you sort of wanted to do this podcast is to make people realize there's nothing shameful about these sort of moments in your career.
It happens to everyone. Everyone has bumps along the way. There's a sense that somehow it's on you, that it's personal, and it's not. I think normalizing that is just something we need to do because it reminds us all that we're not alone. And I don't know why. Maybe because as a child, we got sort of removed from our community. This idea of creating belonging, now I understand looking back, right? Now that I can take a minute, say, oh, that really mattered to me. Like so much of what I now do is about that because I want it not to feel like the middle school that it felt like for me, for other people.
So that kind of gets us to today, what you're doing now, this project you're doing now that's incredibly focused on community, The Longest Table. So in addition to doing this podcast, you have this nonprofit that you launched during the pandemic. Talk about how that came to be and how that ties to your sort of need for community.
Yeah, so I went back into the job at Nextdoor. I took the job 3 weeks before the pandemic. My first week was in San Francisco. Second week was in London because I ran international. Third week was in New York, shutting down the office. There was a moment where I was taking a phone call in the pantry, hiding from my family, who used to not see my crazy work schedule because I was in a hotel or like in an office. Now, like, the world is ending and mom has no boundaries and it's on full display because she's hiding in the pantry taking a phone call from Australia. That moment of being needed by your neighbors, right, was basically the cornerstone of what Nextdoor was built for. That first month, our traffic went up 80% because you needed neighbors to check in on people or find Lysol wipes. And I think by that summer, people started saying New York was dead. And we'd moved back. We were living back in the house in Chelsea. And I remember this house in Chelsea where we're shooting the podcast. And I said to my husband, we need to try and figure out how to help New York. Because I had proposed doing a campaign including New York to the board. And they were like, New York is dead. I was like, so these aren't just articles. Like, my Who's Who board is saying things like New York is dead. So Andy went to the store where we were going to come back with groceries that we were going to Lysol wipe. I sent an email to 20 people. I said, I don't know what to do, but I'm game to get on a call to figure it out. By the time he came back, all 20 people had said yes. And we got on the call. We really didn't know what to do, but, you know, it's the power of community. We thought about a lot of things and sort of honed in on trying to change the narrative of New York because there was a lot of marketers in the group. And we basically raised a little money as a side hustle. We paid artists a stipend and would have them perform outside as a way to remind themselves and us and the world that we weren't dead.
Right, you had these pop-up events, one on Broadway.
Yeah, a moment for Broadway, and then we did 14 of those, and then we were able to get Billy Joel to grant us the rights to New York State of Mind, and we made this music video. I was still at Nextdoor.
I know. I used to joke that you're the only person I know who had a full-time job during the pandemic who started a full nonprofit as a side hustle.
Yeah. So I was still at Nextdoor. Now, I mean, there were 700 volunteers, so it's not like it was a
right.
It
wasn't
not
just you.
Me.
Andy was very instrumental.
Was very instrumental, as were the 700 volunteers. But I think in doing that work, it unlocked something for me. So I have this vivid memory of a moment for Broadway, which was Bernadette Peters and 24 Broadway performers on that red steps of Times Square at the height of the pandemic, right? We had COVID producers and masks, and they were crying because it was the first time they'd been together. And I remember being like, how did an immigrant girl get here? Like, that sense that I could be there for the city that had given me so much, that I could, with a community of people, come together to make that moment happen. It really was a powerful, very purpose-driven, not about money, like, moment of art, right? So I think that unlocked something for me. And so when I was asked if I would leave Nextdoor and, you know, try and come up with a campaign for New York City, which led to the We Love New York City campaign, I was fortunate enough that I was able to walk away from like a paying job to do something that was much more, you know, purpose-driven, passion-driven. And so I stepped off the wheel again.
Right. I mean, you didn't really step off the wheel because you did the We Love New York campaign. It was a big campaign.
It was a big campaign on a shoestring.
Right. It's not like you were making a huge
I wasn't
amount of
making
money.
CMO money.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I stepped off as in I stepped off the corporate game.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
Not I don't know how to step off. We've already, I think.
Yeah.
We've established that.
Yeah.
But, you know, with a group of people for not a lot of money, right? So for the passion of it, we basically launched the We Love New York City campaign for the Partnership for New York and ran at that for about a year and a half.
Okay. Let's talk about that for a second. Because here is one of your most notorious, sort of like well-established, I think some people would call it a failure. I don't actually think it was a failure, but I don't think
of it as a failure.
This thing that was like very publicly panned, right? You launched this We Love New York campaign. There is this logo that people just have this terrible reaction to. Hate the logo. And like the New Yorker writes a piece of, I mean, it is just widely mocked.
Everywhere.
This thing.
It was everywhere.
Right. So I don't think the campaign was a failure either, but I think a lot of people, if they had launched something and like unveiled the logo and become like a running joke in the city for some period of time. I mean, not you personally, but this thing.
It was only a short period of time.
It was a short period of time, but it was a couple weeks. I mean, I think I would have found that actually much more difficult than you did. I mean, you sort of
that's
saw
so
it
funny.
as an opportunity, I think.
It was an opportunity. I mean, okay, so, I mean, basically, we run at this idea to do an effort for the city. What came out into the market was not what we presented, but, you know, you're not in charge, you have a client. Kathy Wild said she was going to raise money. I told her it was going to be at least $10 million. But really, we need 30 is what the guys at Bloomberg said. And we raised $1.5 million. I remember saying to the team, like, we have $1.5 million, we can go with $1.5 million, which is nothing. And it's already not the idea that we had initially had. We launched the logo. So basically, we take the Milton Glaser mark that's I Love New York, and we iterate it to become We Love New York because it's a moment for we and not me. And we animate the heart. So the article comes out, we do the press conference, and hate on the logo just begins at an immense level.
Immediately.
Immense.
Immediately.
Nobody reads.
What would the reading have done for them?
Because they thought we were getting rid of I Love New York.
Oh, I see. They thought it was replacing
The hate was we were replacing I Love New York. Like, who would replace Milton Glaser's iconic mark? I don't know.
I see.
We gathered at the house to just have a moment as a team, and founders said we should go back at the campaign. Like, let's clap back. And they came up with an ad that said, we love critics. That was the pivotal turning point on the campaign because we clapped back instead of sort of cowering and
Right. Instead of getting
home.
defensive, you sort of embraced it.
We embraced it. And I think the clap back, it was such a genius move. And by the way, I give Kathy Wild a lot of credit because she was the client and she could have at that moment done what a lot of brands do, which is go hide with their tail. But she was like, let's go. And so we put that out there and then things slowly began to change. And I think the campaign had so many good lines, many of which were written by Mark Katz, like we get more done by 8 a.m. than Boston does, you know, in a day. All of a sudden, the mayor of Boston is on TV talking about the campaign.
Right.
You know, we don't hate except for the Red Sox. The controversy generated 2 times the exposure of a Super Bowl in 24 hours.
Right. So it's like, in this case, the failure became
study.
an opportunity.
The failure was an opportunity.
And after the LA fires, they used We Love LA as
I know.
a
And the
mark.
mark continues to live on and show up in a lot of different ways.
So that's a good sort of moment to make lemonade out of lemons. What that leads you to, though, is The Longest Table, which is kind of your primary project now. So tell people what that is who may not know and why that is so important to you.
Well, coming out of COVID, all of a sudden, I'd been in place for much longer, right? Like I described, I was always on a train, plane, or automobile or subway because I love the subway. All of a sudden, I was in place, right? And I got to know my neighbors because we were helping each other with Lysol wipes and whatever else. And I saw a picture of what I now know to be neighbors in Egypt having a meal together. It must have been iftar. But for me, it was just a picture of people having a meal down a long table. And I posted it in my personal next door and said, what if we did this? What if we got to know our neighbors, not just in COVID, but otherwise? And it led me to meet 8 neighbors I didn't know with Jim, who had been working on the open street here in Chelsea. And we decided to try it. Literally, it was just a let's try it idea. I met the 8 neighbors. I said, I'll start a Google Doc. They said, what is that? I said, don't worry, I'll teach you. And
You were the startup girl now.
I was always the startup girl. Remember, I had City Search in me from the get-go.
That's true.
And so we tried it. We literally had no idea if it was going to work. We rented the tables and chairs, put them down the street, opened up an Eventbrite for a free event. And that first year, 500 people showed up. And then the next year, 700. And this past year, we had over 2,000 people. But what's amazing about The Longest Table is that it wasn't like I had a business plan and I thought I was starting a movement. It was just a what if idea. And pretty quickly, just like with New York City Next, we were always willing to share the IP and have other people do it because it was never about us. Again, I would occasionally get asked to speak. I spoke once. Somebody said, I'd love to do one. We created a toolkit. So now somebody else could replicate it with the toolkit and some coaching. This past year, 50 happened across the country. We only throw the one in Chelsea. Other people find us organically through a Squarespace website or an Instagram that usually I'm the one updating, so that's terrifying. We had an operating budget of $15,000 because everything else was volunteers, but 50 tables happened last year, 15 of them just in New York, thrown by other people with help and a toolkit, but theirs done in their way. And it's been this incredible gift, honestly, that keeps on giving.
So it's kind of full circle, right? We started with what happened to us, with us sort of being dislodged from community, right? Going through this revolution. And now you find yourself kind of in this third act where you have actively decided that what you really seek is that community that you lost. How does that feel to be in this place now, to sort of be focused on that?
Some days hard. I mean, some days I joke, like it was easier being the global CM of Hyatt, which was not an easy job because you had teams and resources and systems. This is a much lonelier experience. It's like favors and friends and freelancers. Some days somebody shows up, some days somebody gets a new job. You know, there's a lot of unknowns, and I joke, I'm juggling 6 jobs, not one. It would be easier to focus on one, right? But I'm in charge of my own destiny to some degree, right? And some days I get anxious about not making money the way I used to, right? Oh my God, what about healthcare? Like these are real things. But I think the other thing that's been a real gift is that over the last 18 months, I now am also part of a community of C-suite executives or founders who are all going through gap sabbatical or transition, right? And so there's just a lot of us going through that. And I think this idea of normalizing the messy parts, the pauses, the minute to be intentional. And I think I was never motivated by money.
Well, I think for both of us, money was security, right? It was
Money
like
was
it was
security.
fixing a thing that broke after Dad died.
Yeah.
It was being able not to be afraid. But it wasn't about how could you make the most amount of money possible.
Yeah. And so, you know, there's a lot of people who are like, you should take the longest table and commercialize it, hockey stick it to the right. And for me, it's really about rebuilding trust. And I think that there's an opportunity, given what's happening in the world, to rebuild trust. And trust happens from the ground up. And I learned things in doing the longest table that I would never have learned at Hyatt. And part of the other thing that motivates me is learning and trying new things, right? And so I also love working with Andy. And I think that's also been a gift of that process. I'm just much more present on a different level than I was before. So I think there are trade-offs, but there are days where I'm like, should I get another job? Or somebody gets a job. I mean, there are very few jobs that tempt me, but somebody will get a job. I'm like, maybe I should have applied for that. So it's there. That doesn't go away. But this idea of trying to do the little thing that you can in a world that feels on most days like we're in chaos, it gives me a sense of agency. And what I love about the longest table is that it gives everyone who steps in, from the people who bring the food to the people who organize, who volunteer, a sense of agency. And I think we all need to find a way to feel like we can play a part because, yeah, we're individuals, but we also want to be part of something bigger. And the something bigger these days can be very depressing. So I don't know. Maybe it all comes back to Iran and the sofra that we all sat around. I don't know.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it. Maybe you can stop bobbing and weaving for a bit now.
I don't think so. Well, you've made it to this end of the episode where, you know, we changed seats. My sister Susie asked the questions and I got to answer them. By the way, I much prefer asking the questions. So thanks for making it to the end. I hope you learned something new, got some lessons. Make sure to tell friends, listen, like, you know, that's how this game is played. We need more people to follow us so that we can do more episodes, because in the end, it's about you and not us. Thanks again.